Over the past few weeks, you may have seen a lot of media coverage about Russia's deployment of an advanced new weapon called Oreshnik. Media outlets the world over have described this weapon as a hypersonic missile capable of screaming through the sky at better than Mach 10 before deploying up to a half dozen separate warheads to strike multiple targets on the ground. And this isn't the first time Russia has used this new weapon to garner international attention and to send a pointed message to Western leaders. In November of last year, Russia launched an Oreshnik missile at a facility in Dnipro, Ukraine. But after satellite imagery confirmed minimal damage to the target, it was assessed that Russia probably armed the weapon with dummy warheads, opting to use Oreshnik's first operational flight to try to intimidate American and European supporters of Ukraine, rather than accomplishing any actual tactical or strategic objectives. And based on news coverage of that incident and the headlines I've seen this week, it sure seems to have worked. But what if I told you that Oreshnik isn't a modern hypersonic missile, and in fact, isn't even much of a new weapon at all? What if I were to tell you that Russia is taking advantage of confusion and misunderstanding among the public about hypersonic weapons yet again to pass off dated Cold War technology as something modern, terrifying, and unparalleled? What if I were to tell you that Oreshnik is just another Kinzhal, decades-old technology adorned in modern nomenclature to present the image of a Russia that just doesn't exist? Oreshnik is just another ballistic missile. And while that doesn't make it useless, it also doesn't make it groundbreaking. So let's talk about Oreshnik, why it does pose a legitimate threat to targets in Europe, but also why most media coverage of this weapon is badly missing the mark. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. NASA wants to put a 100 kilowatt nuclear reactor on the moon by 2030, and the internet isn't sure how to feel about that. But Russia and China are already working on building their own nuclear-powered moon base, so it would seem the race is on. And I've been staying on top of this story with Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all over the world and then places them all into a single easy-to-read feed that helps me not just stay on top of what's going on, but to see right through most common forms of media bias. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 357 outlets have already covered this story, including 48 left-leaning ones and 59 right-leaning ones. And there are some pretty stark differences in the way each side is covering the story. Right-leaning outlets largely emphasize that China and Russia are also planning to build a nuclear-powered moon base, framing NASA's effort as something of a new space race, with headlines like, NASA aims for nuclear reactor on the moon by 2030 to beat China and Russia. Left-leaning outlets, on the other hand, seem to lean into misconceptions about nuclear power, using phrases like, what could go wrong, come again, and even calling it a crazy NASA plan. Now, it is worth noting that the US launched the first nuclear reactor into orbit all the way back in 1965, so it's not exactly like the concept is unheard of. And Ground News also shows you vital information about each of these outlets along with their headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, corporate ownership, or even government affiliations. And I love the Ground News For You tab that compiles stories that are sure to interest me because they're based on topics that I've selected to stay on top of. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or just follow that link down in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. If you've followed this channel for a while, you are already well aware of how Russia uses a network of state-sponsored media outlets and digital armies of fake social media accounts to advance a wide variety of false narratives regarding their military performance in Ukraine and, just generally speaking, the level of capability brought to bear by the Russian defense apparatus as a whole. But just in case you're new here, I think it's worth pointing out that while many in the West came to this understanding in the years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I was one of the few analysts shouting about Russia's smoke and mirrors military from every rooftop and news outlet that would have me since long before Russia fumbled its invasion of a nation the size of Texas with 1/10 its military footprint on its own border. All the way back in 2018, I began sounding the alarm about how Russia had recognized Western media's affinity for sensationalized news coverage, and that they had begun intentionally leaning into those hyperbolic headline practices to bolster perceptions of Russian military capabilities, even when those capabilities were exaggerated or, in some cases, didn't even exist in the first place. In fact, just to prove a point, I'll quote myself from a piece of analysis published on August 6th of 2018. Quote, "It comes as little surprise that Russia's expensive dreams of a T-14 tank-laden military are being postponed indefinitely. With a struggling economy and stagnant defense budget, Vladimir Putin's modernization initiatives throughout Russia's military have widely been sacrificed at the altar of higher-profile programs like the RS-28 Sarmat ICBM, the Status 6 nuclear torpedo, and the Uran-9 ground combat drone. While most of these systems amount to little more than smoke and mirrors, they offer greater credibility in geopolitical discussion than a fleet of actually capable tanks do. As such, like the Su-57, it was more important to Russia that they develop the platform than it ever was to actually produce them in usable numbers. Russia's efforts at military modernization have more to do with perception than capability, as Russia couldn't technically afford to enter into an actual war with an opponent like the United States anyway. And I've continued covering the way Russia uses media manipulation to try to convince the world that they're a dominant military force ever since. Longtime Sandboxx news readers may recall an article that I published just 2 days before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, back on February 22nd of 2022. That article was called "How Russia Uses the Media to Convey a False Image of Military Prowess," outlining their emphasis on headline-grabbing efforts over legitimate military capabilities, ranging from claims of fielding Predator-style active camouflage to doomsday 50-megaton nuclear torpedoes to nuclear-powered cruise missiles with unlimited range to the Su-75 checkmate that to date has still yet to manifest. And in that piece, I once again highlighted how Western media outlets are eager to report on new weapons or military capabilities that could put their audience at risk. Because the news media knows that few things drive clicks, comments, and shares quite like the fear or the anxiety or the nationalistic outrage that those kinds of headlines tend to prompt. Ultimately, the media's breathless coverage of every new piece of Russian military equipment that led up to the invasion of Ukraine became something of a win-win for both Putin and the Western media industry. The billions of collective views news outlets were able to garner by taking Russian claims at face value and then reporting them as though they were facts not only paid their bills, but it served as free advertising for the Russian defense industrial base, which itself was something of a house of cards, meant to seem as advanced as any in the world, but that was actually largely reliant on foreign customers to fund its real and somewhat anemic modernization efforts. And among the long list of Russian vaporware programs specifically aimed at feeding the Western media's hyperbole machine, I'd argue that none were more effective than Putin's ever-growing list of, quote, hypersonic missiles. Now, back on March 1st of 2018, Putin announced to the world that Russia was putting several unstoppable, as he described them, new missiles into service, including the world's first two modern and operational hypersonic weapons, at least according to him. The first was the 9S-7760 Kinzhal missile, and the second was the avant-garde nuclear hypersonic glide vehicle. Now, we've discussed both of these weapons at length in the past, so I'll spare you the nuts and bolts this time. But suffice to say that Kinzhal soon proved to be nothing more than an air-launched ballistic missile that was actually based directly on the 9K-720 Iskander-M short-range ballistic missile that started development so long ago that it began as a Soviet program. Ballistic missiles, like Kinzhal, have achieved hypersonic speeds since their very inception all the way back in World War II. But Russia recognized that most Western media outlets would not understand the difference between ballistic missiles that can fly at hypersonic speeds but are generally predictable and thus easier to intercept, and modern hypersonic missiles that sustain hypersonic speeds while maneuvering to make intercept all but impossible, at least for most modern air defense systems. Now, I want to be clear about responsibility in media here. I don't expect you, the average person skimming through the news on your lunch break, to have all the context and understanding required to differentiate between a new hypersonic missile and a new air-launched ballistic missile. You have enough on your plate. But I'm a journalist who's worked in the media industry for a solid decade now. I've worked with editors who've overseen Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism. I've written for more than a dozen different outlets, had my work cited by government agencies ranging from the Congressional Research Service in the United States to engineering organizations in Russia. And I know how rigorous fact-checking can be in credible organizations. It is a journalist's job to find truth in their reporting. And often, it's an editor's job to find a way to package that truth with a catchy headline that'll get you to click. And that means that journalists and news outlets either didn't do the research required to actually report the truth about Kinzhal and similar weapons, or worse, they did do the research, but they chose to misrepresent the facts anyway for the sake of driving clicks and, in turn, revenue by using buzzwords like hypersonic, even when they aren't appropriate. In either regard, I would call that journalistic malpractice. But these days, I'm not just a journalist, I'm also an editor. And as an editor, I do think it's important to note that the responsibility and the blame really falls on the editors more than the journalists. Even I've had headlines on my work changed prior to being published to misrepresent the reporting that I put into the article and make the headline a bit catchier. It's just something that journalists have to deal with. Once you turn your draft in, it doesn't belong to you anymore. But despite nerds like me calling out Kinzhal for what it was prior to 2021, it wasn't until May of 2023 when American-sourced Patriot air defense systems started shooting Kinzhal missiles down over Ukraine that the majority of the media started to realize that these missiles they'd been touting as unstoppable were, well, actually pretty stoppable. And since then, most reputable news outlets have shifted their coverage of Kinzhal to call it what it really is: an air-launched ballistic missile similar in design and function to weapons dating back as far as America's Skybolt missile from the 1950s. Likewise, Russia's Avant-Garde, a nuclear hypersonic glide vehicle meant to be delivered by Russia's newest and most advanced ICBM, the RS-28 Sarmat, has also seen very few, in fact apparently only one, successful end-to-end flight test. And the Sarmat missile, meant to carry Avant-Garde, isn't doing any better, with one successful flight test in 2022 and each of its 4 subsequent tests ending in explosive failures. Then there's Russia's Zircon hypersonic cruise missile that's repeatedly been touted as a true modern hypersonic weapon as well. But despite Russia's grandiose claims, there is still absolutely no evidence that it's anything more than a supersonic cruise missile that can achieve hypersonic speeds, but by trading the maneuverability of a cruise missile for an arcing ballistic flight path that can allow it to accelerate beyond Mach 5 while making it a lot more predictable for intercept. But why am I taking you on this stroll down Russian vaporware memory lane? Well, despite what it might seem, it wasn't just to say I told you so. It's really because recent media coverage of Russia announcing the deployment of these Oreshnik missiles makes it entirely clear to me that the news industry learned nothing from Kinzhal, because it's making all of the same mistakes all over again. Over the past few days, Western news outlets like CNN, the Associated Press, Euronews, and the Kyiv Independent, among a long list of others, have all touted Russia's Oreshnik missile as a new hypersonic weapon, while some outlets have gotten it at least a little better, like Reuters, who described it as a new hypersonic ballistic missile. In fact, as I scrolled through media coverage of this weapon, I only came across one mainstream news outlet to correctly identify Oreshnik for what it actually is. That outlet was the New York Times, which accurately labeled this weapon as an intermediate-range ballistic missile. In fact, despite entering service in 2025, Oreshnik is really only a new missile in name and packaging. Multiple independent analysts all point to Oreshnik actually just being a shorter-ranged version of the defunct RS-26 ICBM from 2008, with its 3 rocket stages reduced to 2 and its overall circumference reduced to boot. And that RS-26 itself was derived from the RS-24 that started 4 years prior, and that missile borrowed its design heavily from weapons like the Topol M ICBM that, you guessed it, was designed prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. As Fabian Hoffman, a doctoral research fellow at Oslo University and non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, put it, and I quote, "I think basically they just took apart the RS-26, or just cannibalized it, and then put together this new missile with a couple of upgrades and a new paint job." That is all to say that Oreshnik is not a groundbreaking new hypersonic missile, you guys. It is a Cold War ballistic missile that modern air defense systems, like the U.S. Army's THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, and the U.S. Navy's SM-3 Block 2A interceptors that are carried in American warships, or Israel's Arrow 3, among other systems, were all purpose-built to bring down. But it is worth noting that Ukraine lacks those sort of high-altitude ballistic missile defenses, which is why they're so susceptible to Oreshnik missile strikes. Now, just like Kinzhal, Oreshnik is a dated but high-speed weapon that flies along a broadly predictable arcing ballistic flight path in order to achieve its extreme speeds. According to Russian claims and Ukrainian intelligence reports, Oreshnik can exceed Mach 10 during its unpowered descent, but it does so in the same way America's Minuteman ICBMs have broken Mach 20 for the past 63 years. That doesn't mean this weapon isn't dangerous, but it does mean this weapon doesn't represent a particularly new or different type of threat than other ballistic missiles already in service all around the world. Now, again, the distinction between ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles is not about speed. Both weapons achieve speeds in excess of Mach 5 in flight, and in fact, ballistic missiles often reach higher overall velocities and often even reach their targets faster than most hypersonic weapons do. What differentiates the two is how modern hypersonic weapons can maneuver somewhat unpredictably and to greater extents than the course corrections allowed by ballistic warheads, and that makes them a lot harder to shoot down. The very first ballistic missile, Germany's V-2 rocket back in World War II, achieved hypersonic speeds during its unpowered descent, and so has just about every single ballistic missile to come since. So saying hypersonic ballistic missile is sort of like saying caffeinated Red Bull. Everybody knows that Red Bulls are usually caffeinated, so there's no reason to specify that. To borrow a term from screenwriting, it's putting a hat on a hat, or it's adding a redundant flourish for effect. And that is not good journalistic tradecraft, it's marketing. In the case of hypersonic ballistic missiles, these outlets are using the scary buzzword hypersonic to present these weapons as something new, serious, and scary. We see the same practice employed in coverage of weapons like Iran's Shahed 136 or Russia's Garan 2, which meet the criteria to be defined as cheap, low-capability cruise missiles, but are usually referred to as kamikaze drones instead because, well, that makes for a much more dramatic headline. And it's the drama, not the information, that ultimately pays their bills. Now, to be fair, Russia's use of Oreshnik in Ukraine last November did represent the first time some missile technologies have been brought to bear in actual combat. In particular, it marked the first ever combat use of multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, commonly called MIRVs or MIRV warheads. As the weapon descended, it deployed a reported 6 MIRV warheads, each of which then released 6 of their own smaller submunitions, creating something of a cluster bomb effect with those 36 bomblets raining down over a fairly dispersed area. In November's strike, those submunitions were inert, simply tearing holes in the roofs of buildings when they were struck, but doing little damage beyond that. And upon watching footage of that strike, Jeffrey Lewis, the director of the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, assessed that the dispersion of those submunitions suggested a weapon that was designed primarily as a nuclear weapon rather than a conventional one. Like similar IRBMs of the past, he estimates the weapon has a circular error probable, or CEP, of 50 to 200 meters, meaning that roughly half of any Oreshniks launched at a target would make landfall within that distance. And as such, using 36 distributed submunitions over a fairly large area is likely more about actually hitting your intended target at all, rather than making the damage as widespread as possible. Nuclear warheads, of course, just don't need the same degree of accuracy as conventional warheads do, because nuclear warheads produce a massive blast radius that's sure to consume any nearby targets, even if you miss by 600 feet or more. Now, despite being the first combat use of these MIRV warheads, they aren't a new technology either. In fact, the first MIRV warheads to enter service in the world were American, installed in the Minuteman III ICBM all the way back in 1970, and then in the Poseidon C-3 SLBM in 1971. The Soviets eventually followed suit by the close of the decade with their R-36M, and then France, China, and the UK would all field their own similar systems in the years that followed. The reason MIRVs haven't seen combat use before isn't because they represent such a groundbreaking capability, but rather because they're pretty expensive, and as a result aren't really practical for anything other than strategic assets like nuclear weapons. But there's also another reason why long-range ballistic missiles with MIRV warheads have not been employed for conventional warfare in the past. Because the nations that detect the launch won't be able to differentiate between a nuclear and a conventional long-range ballistic missile strike with their sensors. And that means running a high risk of prompting a full nuclear response to your launch. In fact, the United States did consider fielding conventionally armed long-range ballistic missiles at one point as a part of the Navy's conventional prompt strike program. But as William Albuquerque, a visiting fellow at the Henry L. Stimson think tank in D.C., recently put it, that idea was shelved because, and I quote, "it was stupid. This risk is so serious that the Russian government even reached out to the United States 30 minutes before they launched Oreshnik at Ukraine to provide advanced warning of the launch and to clarify that it was not a nuclear weapon. A warning that the US obviously then relayed to Ukraine. For all of Russia's constant threats of nuclear war, the last thing they wanted to do was actually start one. What they really wanted was for every news outlet in the Western world to run headlines about Russia's terrifying new hypersonic weapon that could strike targets anywhere in Europe within only a few minutes' notice. And while conventional MIRV warheads may not be a cost-effective way to engage targets on the battlefield, the media attention Russia garnered was worth a fortune. Now, I want to be clear that while Russia and a great deal of media coverage have overtly exaggerated Oreshnik's strategic value, that doesn't mean the weapon can't have a devastating effect on the battlefield. Ballistic missiles like Russia's Iskander and Kinzhal have both played important roles in Russia's battlefield successes in Ukraine to date, and an intermediate-range ballistic missile like Oreshnik provides Russia with the means to rapidly strike targets within around 5,500 kilometers, or roughly 3,400 miles. That means this weapon, armed with a nuclear payload, could reach targets anywhere in Europe or even as far west as parts of Greenland, but couldn't reach the American shore. In broad strokes, then, Oreshnik is just another nuclear ballistic missile like the hundreds Russia already has in service, and the only truly unique threat it represents over a standard ICBM that we're accustomed to discussing as part of Russia's nuclear saber rattling is its comparatively short flight time due to its shorter range, which dramatically cuts down the time a defending nation has to mount a successful intercept. Oreshnik isn't vaporware like the Uran-9 ground combat drone or the Su-75 Checkmate, but it isn't a game-changing new capability either. It's just another ballistic missile. Like so many modern Russian missile programs that drive headlines and bad faith comments under videos like this, and you'll find them down there, it's really just a pile of old Soviet technology rolled out under a fresh new coat of paint to get Western media whipped up into a frenzy. And I am frustrated to report that, to at least some extent, that plan seems to have worked again. But now, at least we'll all know better, and hopefully we'll take a bit more of a critical eye at headlines touting scary new hypersonic missiles that aren't new missiles at all, or kamikaze drones that are just bad cruise missiles, and whatever the internet hype machine latches onto next. Because all of these weapons really do present threats to Ukraine, to Europe, to the United States, and to the collective West. But we can only effectively counter those threats with clear eyes, in an evidence-based understanding of their actual capabilities. Not the ones that Putin claims they have, not the ones that'll drive the most clicks, the real ones. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.